Senator Thurman takes Daniel Keene into a hangar and asks him one question. Does he want to help save the world? Everyone watching knew exactly what that meant. He's about to design the silos. Here's the part almost nobody is talking about. The show already told us this, not in episode 6, in episode 1. And it told us again in episode 4. Both times, it hid the answer inside a detail so small, it was easy to miss on a first watch. Today, we're going back through those two episodes, lining them up against what episode 6 just confirmed, and checking that against a theory that's been spreading through the Silo fan community for weeks. Along the way, we'll get into something the showrunner said in a recent interview that most recap channels have skipped over entirely, and it changes how you should be watching the back half of this season. Let's start with the theory, because it deserves a fair hearing before we take it apart. The theory going around right now says Daniel already built the silos, and that his memory of doing it was removed afterward. That's why he's spending this season as a freshman congressman investigating his sister's accident, instead of a man who already designed 50 underground cities. It's not a lazy read. The people making this argument point to a real gap in the story. Daniel has exactly the engineering background the Silo project needs. So why does Thurman spend so much of this season courting him instead of simply hiring him? Why the surveillance? Why the slow squeeze on his personal life, if he's already the obvious choice? The theory answers that by saying Thurman isn't recruiting him for the first time, she's re-recruiting him. And the strongest piece of evidence for that reading sits in episode 4, inside an apartment that belongs to a man named Palmer, who we're told is Helen's ex. Some viewers think Daniel might be standing inside his own former home without recognizing it. It's a fun theory. It also runs into a problem, and we'll get to that problem in a few minutes. But first, let's build the case the show has actually been making, because it's stronger than the theory it's competing with. Go back to Thurman's first real conversation with Daniel. She spends most of it complimenting him, and she's specific about which parts of his resume she brings up. His time with the Army Corps of Engineers, a flood control project he ran in New Orleans, and one invention in particular, a drill capable of boring deep underground without disturbing the surface above it. Then she adds one more detail. Replacing the levees with tunnels was Daniel's idea. Now hold that next to what the Silo project actually requires. 50 structures, each around 144 stories deep, packed into a single field outside a city, built without anyone in that city noticing. That's not primarily a secrecy problem. It's a digging problem. Excavating something that size normally means mountains of displaced earth, trucks running around the clock for years, road closures, permits, and every local news crew and range showing up to ask what's being built. You cannot hide a hole that big unless the machine digging it leaves the ground on top looking untouched. That's what Daniel invented, years before Thurman ever came looking for him. New Orleans wasn't a side project. It was the audition, even though nobody called it that at the time. He solved a hard underground engineering problem, built the technology to pull it off, and did it all through a federal agency, which means his file was sitting exactly where a government project would go looking for a solution, long before episode 1 even starts. Here's where it gets interesting for anyone who's been watching since season 1. In that first season, George Wilkins takes Juliet down to the bottom of Silo 18 and shows her a massive digging machine, abandoned in the dark. It's the machine that carved out the silo. It was left down there because there was never a way to bring it back to the surface. And by the time anyone in Juliet's era found it, every usable part had already been stripped for scrap. Somebody engineered that machine. Somebody worked out how to bore over 100 stories into solid rock. The show handed us the wreckage of that achievement in its very first season. 3 years, in our time, before it ever introduced the man who invents exactly that capability. The chamber even carries a name tied to the machine, the Digger Void. It's been at the center of this show for years without most viewers clocking the connection. George used it as a hiding spot. Martha Walker sealed it after the rebellion. Robert Sims used it to keep Bernard hidden for months while the rest of the silo believed he'd been cremated. Every major secret buried in Silo 18 has literally been buried inside a hole that Daniel's technology carved out. Season 1 showed us the machine. Season 3 is showing us the man who built it. Daniel Keene is not the character's name in Hugh Howey's original novels. In the books, this character is called Donald. Showrunner Graham Yost has confirmed in interviews that he changed the first name specifically to avoid the character reading as a stand-in for a certain sitting political figure, given how loaded that particular first name currently is in American politics. It's a small production choice, but it tells you the writers are being unusually careful with how this character is presented, which matters when you're trying to work out how much the show is winking at us versus how much it's playing straight. That carefulness is worth remembering when you weigh the memory wipe theory, because Yost has also talked in recent interviews about how deliberately the show handles what the audience is allowed to see. Silo hides information from its characters constantly. That's basically the show's entire engine. But it has been far more careful about not hiding information from the people watching at home, especially inside the Before Time storyline, which functions almost like a separate, straighter drama sitting next to the mystery box present-day plot. That distinction matters, because the memory wipe theory only works if the show has been quietly lying to its audience about what we're watching in episode 4. Everything else we know about how this season is constructed argues against that. Let's go back to that scene the theory leans on. Daniel and Helen are hiding out in an apartment that Helen says belongs to her ex, a man named Palmer, currently on assignment in South Sudan. Daniel takes his shoes off, looks around, notices a large photo of Helen still on the wall, and jokes that when a relationship of his ends, the first thing he does is bury the evidence. Stop on that line for a second, because it's doing more work than it looks like. This is a man who invented a machine specifically designed to put things underground and leave no trace on the surface. And his throwaway instinct, the thing he reaches for without thinking, is that when you want something gone, you put it deep in the earth where nobody will find it. 2 episodes later, a senator asks him to do exactly that to the human race. But look at what rules out the idea that Daniel is secretly Palmer. The show names Palmer outright. He's not a vague blank the writers left open. We're told specifically where he is, on assignment in South Sudan, which isn't a detail you invent for a man who doesn't exist. The photo of Helen on the wall establishes a relationship the show clearly wants us to read as real and separate from Daniel. And Daniel asks Helen directly whether Palmer minds her coming and going, which is not a question you ask about your own home. There's one more detail in that apartment worth sitting with, and it's not about Daniel at all. There's a painting on the wall Daniel keeps glancing at, showing a shrouded figure leading a group of children into the distance. Nobody in the scene explains it. Nobody even mentions it out loud. In a season that's about to show us a chosen population being led underground by people who won't explain why, that image is doing quiet, deliberate work. So why does Daniel agree in that hangar? By episode 6, he has almost nothing left. His investigation into his sister's crash has been shut down. His source vanished. His contact at the Pentagon backed out. His phone was destroyed, and his car started making decisions for him. Every piece of leverage he had has been quietly removed, and all of that pressure traces back to Thurman's side of the board. Then there's the piece he can't walk away from. His sister Charlotte, a Navy pilot who, according to the actors involved, develops a serious instinct that something is wrong right before her final flight, comes back from that flight with a traumatic brain injury and no memory of her own family. Her ongoing care runs through a clinic funded by a family connected to the same night her squadron went down. Whoever wants Daniel building silos also controls where his sister gets treated. Saying yes isn't really about saving the world for him. It's about keeping the only family he has left inside a facility that could turn her away tomorrow. And Helen isn't in that hangar by accident either. She's a journalist who, according to the show's own backstory for her, once lost a job for protecting a source, including bending the truth to do it. That's not a flaw Thurman happens to overlook. That's a very specific quality to want in the person who might eventually write the official version of this story for the public record. Which brings us to the part of this that's genuinely unsettling. Daniel may end up designing the digging without ever being told what the silos are actually for. Nobody necessarily has to erase his memory. Nobody has to tell him the real purpose in the first place. Someone else handles the water systems. Someone else builds the safeguard. Someone else decides who eventually walks through the door. Every person involved does excellent, specialized work on their own narrow piece, and almost none of them ever see the whole design. That's not just how you keep a massive project secret. It's the actual operating principle behind the silos 300 years later. Bernard knows more than Sims. The head of a silo knows more than its mayor. Even Bernard, with full access to the vault, doesn't learn the safeguard exists until Lucas eventually tells him. If it turns out that principle started with the people who physically dug the silos, it isn't a new idea introduced this season. It's the origin of a rule the show has been running on since its very first episode. If that reminds you of something outside the show, you're not wrong to make the connection. Large-scale classified projects in the real world have used exactly this structure, compartmentalizing knowledge so that specialists can do brilliant, narrow work without any single person outside leadership understanding the full picture. Silo isn't inventing a new kind of secrecy. It's dramatizing a genuinely old one. Look at how much of this season, on both timelines, is built around controlling what people know. Juliet is being drugged to erase the months she spent outside the silo. Charlotte came back from her final flight with a gap where her memory should be, and the doctor treating her appears to be keeping that gap open rather than closing it. Camille has just introduced a memory suppressant into an entire silo's water supply, and multiple silo populations have already had their memories effectively reset. A season spending this much energy on stolen and controlled memory while simultaneously introducing the engineer who makes the silos physically possible is not telling two unrelated stories. Juliet spends this season trying to recover something that was taken from her. Daniel is being walked towards something enormous while nobody tells him the truth to begin with. She knows a piece of herself is missing. He doesn't yet know there's anything to miss. 300 years apart, and both of them are being managed by people who decided the full truth was too dangerous to hand over. There's a genuinely uncomfortable irony sitting underneath all of this. Daniel spends this entire season trying to find out what really happened to his sister, and loses his sources, his freedom, and eventually the investigation itself along the way. Every one of those losses traces back to the same people who are now offering him a job. The job is building the very thing that will keep humanity alive after a disaster he was never allowed to understand. He may spend the rest of his life on the greatest engineering achievement in human history and never learn what it was actually protecting anyone from. Which is, word for word, the same deal every resident of Silo 18 has been living under for 3 centuries, starting with the very first person who signed on. A quick but important piece of context most viewers don't have yet. Apple confirmed Silo will end after a 4th season, which was filmed back-to-back with this one. That means whatever gets locked into place across these remaining Season 3 episodes is largely permanent. There isn't a Season 5 to walk anything back in. Every reveal from here forward is closer to final than it would be on a show with an open-ended future. It's also worth knowing that this season is loosely adapting the second book in Hugh Howey's trilogy, called Shift, a novel that notably doesn't actually feature Juliet's character at all in that section of the story. The show built her into this timeline deliberately, which tells you the writers are already comfortable diverging from the source material when they think the story needs it. That's useful to keep in mind before assuming any theory is locked to what happens on the page. So here are 3 things that would settle this outright, and any of them could land in the next few episodes. If New Orleans comes up again, expect confirmation that project was never really about flood control in the first place. If Daniel ever recognizes something he has no reasonable way of recognizing, the memory wipe reading comes roaring back to life. And if Thurman's eventual offer comes with a specific rule about what Daniel is and isn't allowed to ask, that's the compartmentalization theory confirmed on screen, not just implied. The drill exists. The tunnels exist. There's a stripped-out digging machine sitting at the bottom of Silo 18 that somebody had to design long before anyone in that silo was born. Daniel just doesn't know yet that he's about to become that somebody.